Hey everybody, Tom Barnes here. Stories from the 78. Are you comfortable, my friends? I mean, because I got a doozy for you today. If you love true crime, you're going to love this. So pull up a chair, grab yourself a smoke, have a drink, because you're going to want to listen to this 78 episode because it is dealing with one of the biggest unsolved murders of all time, like true crime Mount Everest. I'm talking about the Black Dahlia murder that happened back in 1947 to Elizabeth Short. My friend Eli Frankel wrote this amazing, fantastic book. I got it right here, Sisters in Death. And you might be wondering, Sisters in Death, what are you talking? Well, that's how he solved it, and he's going to explain it here in a second. But the Prairie Heiress was a woman that was murdered in Kansas City. And he somehow figured out these two are connected. And that's what this whole book is about. And I welcome Eli to the show right now. Eli, welcome, my friend. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. The world, I bet you, is at your oyster as you're traveling around now on your new book, Sisters in Death, which is a phenomenal book. It's a great look at this incredible story.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
I imagine this has been like a labor of love, like 5 years of your life you devoted to this. And it's not like you don't have anything going on, man. You've like done TV, you've worked at, I swear, look, I was reading the bio of like, you've done almost every job you can do in the business, as they say, from like
Yeah.
producer to camera to writing, showrunner, everything.
Yeah, it's been an interesting ride to say the least. I've seen a lot of changes in Hollywood over the years. It's been quite a journey to say the least. But yeah, I mean the book was a huge amount of time. It started out as being sort of one of these like just hobbyist things. Once the kids are in bed at night or on the
Oh
weekends, you
yeah.
grab a couple hours, and then it just slowly turns into more and more of like a full-time gig, and the research was really really intensive, required a lot of travel and a lot of time, and then eventually turned into kind of formulating a book project and figuring out the structure of it.
I imagine just working in the industry and doing all the medium that is visual, was doing a book and diving into this, because when you write a book, it's like they're in print, either on a screen or actually on paper. I have a copy of the book here, but like you, it's you can mask certain things with video, right? But when you're writing a book, there is no masking. Either you are making sense or you're not, or either you have the
Yeah.
facts or you're not, and you're connecting the dots or you're not. And it's very easy to see. And you did all that by, I imagine, just painstaking research.
Yeah, totally. I mean, the having to do something absolutely historically accurate definitely puts some walls up in terms of like how much creativity you can employ in
Sure.
building out the story. But at the same time, like I've also done a lot of like documentary work, and so it's a very similar thing there. It's a game of figuring out what to keep in, what to keep out, and having to kind of hew very strictly to the facts of the case. But there's also a lot of creativity in terms of how you tell the story. And I think for me, coming from the visual medium and film and television, it actually really ended up helping in terms of the pacing and the structure of the story in developing it. Is like I had all this research and I knew what I wanted to say by the end. But the question then is like, how do you condense what is probably 1,000 or 1,200 pages of written words into a much tighter 350 pages that keeps you moving and
Yeah.
still gets across all those ideas. And so all the work I'd done in documentary and non-scripted television, it's kind of a similar thing in a way. You shoot hundreds of hours of content, and then you have to figure out, what am I going to leave in, what am I going to leave out, and at the same time remain truthful to the story.
Yeah, I have similar roles. When you do any kind of video work and you have it, you always think that that one other piece of video is the one you need to make it all just hum, right? So when you have to like take apart it, to make it fit, that's got like that has kept me up at nights. Just be like, I don't know, should I leave that in? Should I take it out?
Yeah.
So I can't imagine doing something at this level, because you're not just doing like a local documentary or even a documentary about a true crime from some, not that anything are less, but there's true crimes everywhere right now,
Right.
unfortunately. But
Yeah.
it's kind of a big deal in books, in documentaries, the true crime, right? But you went after one of the one of the biggest true crime stories in the history, certainly in Los Angeles, but in the United States. If you would just Can you back up a little bit on when you first heard about this and why you wanted to do the story and connecting the Black Dahlia to the Prairie Heiress murder?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the Black Dahlia itself, like a lot of folks in Los Angeles and Hollywood, I was really attracted to the story early on. It is the ultimate enigma wrapped in a mystery inside
Yeah.
a riddle. But it also reflects so much about the city and so much about Hollywood. And I think we can really understand the mystery that is Los Angeles and Hollywood in some ways through the case. And I mean, the fact that it's subsequently become what is arguably the most famous unsolved murder, not only in Los Angeles history, but likely American history.
Yeah.
It's hard, to ignore the case, especially if you're interested in true crime. So for me, I was just fascinated by the case, and I pretty much ended up reading everything you could read about it, every book, every article. I listened to every podcast, and it was great. But you get to a point where you kind of start to feel like everything that has been discovered about the case and can be discovered about the case is out there. And so there's nothing new to find. It's just sort of repackaging or reorganizing all the information rather than discovering anything new.
Right.
And then ultimately, through my research on a previous documentary I'd done called Helter Skelter about the Manson murders, I started getting a little more professional in my research and diving into archives, city archives and police archives, and
there's
calling
a lot.
yeah,
of
making
that, right?
phone calls to people who were related to those who were, involved in the case or the story in the 1940s, and getting to know them and asking questions. And then all of a sudden you realize there's so much more information to be discovered out there about this case, and likely about nearly every other murder if you put in kind of the gumshoe, on a cop on the beat sort of work of like discovering and trying to hunt down things that hadn't been revealed to the public yet. And I was just amazed by how much information there was to actually find. And then, that sort of propelled this fascination with figuring out this story and connecting it to this other murder in Kansas City, which occurred 6 years earlier from the Black Dahlia murder.
Yeah, and the case, the Black Dahlia murder, went cold in the 50s, right? So it wasn't like there was a whole lot of things after that. And I imagine, I don't know, maybe I'm incorrect in assuming, but I imagine that the way that they handled crime scenes back then, perhaps, I mean, one could argue things haven't changed in that aspect with police work, but maybe they weren't as meticulous as they are now, because you have other things, different technology now to cover up maybe inefficient police work by technology overcompensating for that. But back then it was it was photographs, staging the crime scene, and fingerprints, right? That's essentially what there was, and a testimony of anybody that was there or might have been there.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the police lab in LA did have access to some pretty state-of-the-art technology for that era. There's certain like ultrascopic and fluorescent lights that they use to detect the presence of blood or other, trace evidence and stuff. I mean, they did have technology, but in terms of the police work, one of the issues that the LAPD faced at that time was that most of the cops in the force, or a lot of the cops who were under 30, 35 years old, had been sent out to, to fight in the war during World War II. And so
people forget that.
Yeah, and so as a result, the department had to quickly hire and very quickly train just essentially anybody they could find to cover those spots. And a lot of those cops ended up staying on the force, but they weren't well trained. They'd only been there for a few years. And so it was kind of just like cover your ass during the World War II years. And then you see the results of that to some extent in LAPD up until about 1951, 1952, when Chief William Parker really revamps the department. But, police work has definitely improved. This is an interesting story. I was talking to a detective recently who was really big dude in the LAPD in the 70s and 80s. And he was telling me about, he would go to crime scenes like in other districts of the city and to investigate murders. And like the bodies are still in the houses when he walks in, and there were detectives there from different divisions that had like ordered pizza. And he walked in a couple times and there were pizza boxes inside the crime scene. And he said to them, "Have you guys investigated the pizza box yet? Have you dusted it for fingerprints?" And they said, "Oh no, that's we ordered that pizza. We're just hungry."
Oh
Which
my
turned into a huge fight. You can't bring in pizza into an active crime scene. So the
it's
standards have definitely improved in a lot of ways. And by the way, that's in the 70s. Like, imagine what it
right.
was like in the 40s.
That's what I was talking about earlier. Like, things were just different. They were,
Yeah.
and what they didn't know, they didn't know. Like by contaminating a crime scene, or about the chain of custody, by from where it leaves the crime scene until where it ends up in a lab, and who had it in between.
Yeah.
That was all like, don't worry about it. Versus now, that could make or break a case, and we've seen it play out in court over and over again, right?
Absolutely. I mean, just as an example, when Elizabeth Short, the victim in the Black Dahlia murder, who had been severed cleanly at the midsection, so her internal organs were exposed, when they brought the corpse, the two pieces, back to the morgue, they, after they examined her, they removed the organs. And what you have to do is test for the presence of chemicals, drugs,
Sure.
anything else that might help sort of determine what her state was in the final hours and days of her life. And they actually misplaced the organs and threw them away. So they were never tested, and they have no idea what exactly was in her system. But that would be absolutely unheard of today.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that probably is a case study in criminology book at this point of things not to do.
Yeah. Yeah,
Oh,
exactly. And so even if you had, like, let's say 60 or 70% of the investigation go by the book, the fact that 20 or 30 wouldn't could absolutely undermine an entire investigation.
and I imagine just diving into all of this. I mean, you're talking thousands of pieces of evidence or
Yeah.
notes, or I mean, how did you even begin? Like,
Yeah.
you were just like you mentioned earlier, you became more professional from other documentary, and you did the big one with the Manson murders.
Hmm.
And again, probably the same amount, if not more, of like documentation. Like, how do you go through it all and figure out what's complete crap, or does some of them that's like 98% crap, and then there's a nugget where you're like, oh,
Right.
wait a minute. Like,
Yeah.
so you have to read the entire thing. I just imagine that takes forever.
Yeah, it's a very laborious process, and it requires just time and energy and effort. And especially with a case like this where you have literally hundreds of people that cross paths with the victim or were suspects in the case, you actually have to look at everything. You can't discard anything.
Hmm.
And it's a painstaking process, but I think for me it's actually a lot of fun doing it. And I know that's a weird word, but
No, I
I don't know,
understand.
there's sort of this idea of like the pursuit of justice for the victim all these decades later, and the hunt for finding sort of unknown facts or putting pieces together that haven't ever been considered is it's stimulating in a way, because it feels like you're sort of helping unravel a big sort of historical mystery.
Well, and I imagine there were dozens, if not a few dozen cops over the years that have done, or hundreds at this point, and to be able to uncover something that all of these people did not see or did not find. And sure,
Yeah.
with their help, you did by finding what they did and kind of taking it and move with it. But you kind of became a detective in your own right, because you're doing police work. You're just doing it for a documentary and for justice. But to put this a book together, that probably will be a Netflix documentary at some point. I imagine that all was playing into it in doing all of that and finding all of these things. What popped out where you're like, wait a minute, like there's
Yeah.
this that trails back to something that went on in Kansas City?
Yeah. Well, what's interesting is that and this is sort of the overriding premise of the book, is that there was another murder 6 years earlier
Mm-hmm.
that I believe is connected to the Black Dahlia murder. And what's intriguing here is that theory is not something that I came up with. It was the LAPD's theory, and they were investigating that as early as late January, early February of 1947, just 2 or 3 weeks after the murder. The problem was the suspect they were looking at, that they were pursuing, who they believed may have committed the original murder back in 1941, had left the city, and they didn't know where he was at
Mm-hmm.
one point. And then they also were unable to get the police files from the Kansas City Police Department where this murder occurred. And they tried over and over again, and those files were never sent over. And so the police had an inkling that these two murders had these kind of remarkably similar circumstances to them, and that there was a suspect that they had who verifiably knew and spent a few days with Elizabeth Short, the Black Dahlia, about a month before her murder, but they weren't sure if he knew this woman he had gone to college with who was murdered in 1941 in Kansas City. And so for me, with the benefit of technology today, which is extraordinary, the technological research that we employ that really has only come sort of into maturity in the last 5-10 years, in addition to being able to speak to the children, the nieces, the nephews of folks who were involved in the case who didn't feel the heat that their relatives did. It, in some ways, having some distance, having a few decades distance from the murder actually opens up certain doors. And again, like our ability to access files and information today that is readily available that would have been super sensitive in 1950 or 1948 that even the cops couldn't get a hold of, that gives us such a leg up in being able to look back and investigate this thoroughly. And that's what I love is like pouring through documents and seeing what really transpired in the years after the case with a suspect, and being able to know in a sense the whole picture, and knowing what the LAPD was trying to figure out in the late 40s and early 50s. It's really cool to be able to put together this body of knowledge that they were trying to get, not even that they weren't totally aware of. They were aware of the fact that Kansas City police had all these files and all these details on this 6-year-old murder that might be connected, and who the suspect was and what his life was like and what his mindset was. And we also have the hindsight, the benefit of decades of his life afterwards to take a look at what happened to him and whether there are any behavioral patterns that fit the profile of the killer.
That's incredible, just to have that all sitting out there. And does it infuriate you though, like looking back and going, why didn't Kansas City just share what they had? Was it an ego thing between departments, like, oh, LA's not going to tell us what to do, we know what we're doing here? Was it kind of like small town, like like busting out their chests a little bit, be like, you're not going to tell us, we know what we're doing, like we don't need your help, and we're not sharing? Because I mean, government agencies didn't really start sharing until after 9/11, really, like to give some perspective to that. So I imagine it was a little bit of that back then.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's been really interesting to see the reaction as I do like book tour events and talking to people online and people emailing and calling and all this stuff, which is great. It's really exciting to see people sort of begin their own investigations into the case and sort of pouring through the evidence. But one of the things that people certainly ask about is why KCPD didn't send those files over to LAPD. And there's sort of, a lot of people are a little more conspiratorial than I am. For instance, the suspect, his name is Carl Balsiger. His father was a really powerful executive in a major baking corporation in Kansas City, Interstate Bakeries, that later became Hostess Brands.
Oh my
And he had a pretty close relationship with the Kansas City Police Department for a few decades, and he sat on the fire and police commissions. So, one could obviously go to a more conspiratorial kind of avenue and suggest that maybe he was responsible for killing that effort to send those files over. But I think ultimately the case itself was a huge embarrassment to the Kansas City Police Department. There was a lot of politics behind it. And there was a war between the sheriff's department and the police department that was all sort of caused by politics of the political machine that existed in Kansas City at the time. And so I think the KCPD always felt like this was the case that got away. And the idea that LAPD would jump in and with all its enormous resources and its state-of-the-art technology, that there was a threat in a way of them actually solving the case, which would further damage the Kansas City Police Department at a really vulnerable moment in the late 40s and early 50s. And so, a lot of times the politics between police departments ends up being more of a legitimate reason why information isn't shared rather than some kind of grand conspiracy.
Yeah, just living in for most of my life in Chicago and hearing about, Gacy and even Jeffrey Dahmer stuff that's happened here and, obviously up in Milwaukee
Yeah.
and everything in between, as far as the police department's concerned. There's, yes, lots of great police work out there, but there's also politics, right? And politics really, like some of the things, I've worked in the news business for 20 years of my life. So you hear about some of the things, you're like, are you kidding me?
Yeah.
Like how? But like when somebody says they know a guy, some of them actually know a guy, right? Know
Yeah.
something to get steered. And, I don't know if it happens nearly as much as it did back in the day versus now, just because there's a lot more electronic paper trails versus the paper trails that can just disappear into the trash, I suppose. But as soon as I say that, then something will come out, will debunk that entire thought process. But
Right.
either way, you know, uh, you're talking about the 1941 when that first murder happened. I mean, that's the dawn of World War II as far as the
Yep.
United States is concerned. So to give people a perspective of how long ago that was, I imagine Kansas City, yeah, it's a bigger Midwestern town, I would say, but I imagine back in the 40s, it wasn't as big as it is now, right? So you're talking a close-knit community of police and politicians and people who are making money. We're coming out of the Depression, right? So money's scarce. So anything
Yeah.
to save face, I imagine would go a long way back then.
Yeah, I mean, the thing. So Kansas City was actually, even by the 1930s, was actually a pretty damn good sized town, and its location was kind of crucial to its development. There's literally 16 major railroads that converged in Kansas City. It's right in the heart
Oh,
of the country, and so transportation could kind of go in and out much easier. And it actually was, along with Chicago, the slaughterhouse capital of America. There were thousands of carcasses of cows and pigs and sheep, lamb coming in, chicken coming into Kansas City, and then being sent out across the country. It's a major hub, but as you kind of point out, a lot of cities, even major cities back then, were run by political machines and different political interests that sort of kept the city in its grip. There was a lot of patronage back then as well. You'd vote for the machine and they'd make sure you had a job or certain benefits that,
mm.
came along with voting for them and supporting them. So, I mean, the corruption that existed in the country back then is just, it is such a different picture than today. People think there's corruption today. It's nothing compared to the way things were in the 30s and 40s. And, a police department, a city government would think nothing of falsely accusing somebody if somehow there were a political benefit. Not to say that that was rampant or that most murder convictions were based on that, but it did happen. And in this case, with the murder of Leila Welsh in 1941, her brother was essentially picked out of a hat in a way to be the fall guy in order for the sheriff's department and its backers and the political machine to have a win, a scalp, and prove that they're the ultimate power, even over the KCPD, the Kansas City Police Department. They're willing to sacrifice the life of a young man in order to do that, which is just stunning.
Time and time again, you bring that up, but that through documentaries or books I've read, that happened a lot back then. Like they needed a win, and
Yeah.
he seems like the best guy, so we'll just pin it on him, right?
Yeah.
It's incredible to just read about this. What was in your research when you were looking? I mean, it was pretty specific about how Elizabeth was murdered, right? She was
Mhm.
severed in half, and it was done like I was reading a little bit about it. As was it the blood allegedly drained out after the murder? Like she was cut after she was gone. Is that accurate?
Yeah. So one of the things that I did with there's a significant amount of the autopsy report is included in the original district attorney files in Los Angeles, and there's a lot of detail about what was done to her. And if I'm reading you right, and the question is about what happened to her, she was held captive for 6 days by her killer, and in that time, it appears that she was tied up with wire or rope. She had a harness, like a leather harness, around her neck. There was literally there were traces of the belt buckle that was used on that harness around her neck. So she was tied down, and then likely tortured over a good part of those 6 days. And then on the final day, on the night of January 14th, 1947,
Mhm.
and the early morning hours of January 15th, 1947, the killer went ahead and began his process of whatever the work was that resulted in the Black Dahlia. And that included cutting significant chunks of flesh out of her skin while she was alive, and cutting open her mouth
Yeah.
from the edges towards her ear, not quite at the ear, but close to it, in sort of a V shape, if you will, which is what caused a significant amount of blood loss. She choked on her blood. She died from hemorrhage and shock from the blood loss. But the severing, the clean severing of the body through the midsection began likely right after she died, or as she was dying. There is the presence of what's called ecchymosis, which is like the flow of blood, and it stops when a person's heart stops beating. There was slight ecchymosis found at the midsection where she was cut, so likely he began severing her either immediately after she died, and blood was still sort of being pumped, or was, there was the last vestiges of the pumping of blood from the heart after it ceased when she passed away, or it may have begun while she was sort of in the last moments of life. But there was a concerted effort to drain the body of blood. She had been exsanguinated and then washed in a bathtub or with water of some sort, and then scrubbed with a bristle brush, likely to get rid of fingerprint evidence.
Very intentional work, though, nonetheless,
Yes.
right? Very intentional. And then he dumped the body in an area that was fairly new. It was almost like on the outskirts. Is that right? Like it was a newer community being built at the time.
Well,
or,
kind of.
or was
It's yeah, new-ish for its era.
Yeah.
The body was left in a section of town called Lemaire Park, which had been built up in the 20s and 30s. Really nice area, kind of Art Deco village buildings, very sort of communal, but a lot of homes that have been built up in the 1930s, sort of classic Southern California middle-class homes, a lot of them somewhat Spanish style. But the 2-block stretch in which her body had been dumped, which is the term that people use, was not built up. It was one of the only sections of the town the only sections of Lemaire Park that didn't have construction, and in fact remained an empty lot for about the next 10 years. It took a few years until those streets would be built up. But Lemaire Park it's part of it's near Inglewood. It's part of South Central. It's definitely, it's not downtown, but it's definitely part of the city. It's not like some outpost or remote area, and the entire area is built up and was built up in the 1940s as well.
Interesting. But either way, what you just described, he did to her, obviously they knew what they were doing. That's something that you're just not like I hate to even use the term, but like a Joe Schmo who's like, well, I'm just gonna have this urge, but because it's precise work. To be able to cut somebody in half, you kind of have to know what you're doing, because I am sure it's a lot harder than it seems, because you're going through the spinal cord, severing a body. I mean, that's just, you have to know the body, right?
Yeah, one would suspect. I mean, here's the thing. The LAPD at the time was, they obviously entertained those ideas and tried to figure out what kind of killer this was. This had never been seen before, and it's really never been seen since.
No.
It is a totally unique murder in American history. And so the big question is, who would be capable of doing this? Who would be capable of committing a kind of murder that had never been seen before, a desecration of the human body that was so rare, which is kind of gives you insight into the mindset of this person. Now, it is, and the cops entertained this at the time too. I guess conceivably it's possible that somebody who was curious about human anatomy and maybe had some experience with knives would be able to sever a human body without really puncturing the organs and understanding where to going through the second and third lumbar bone of the spine, which is the most opportune location on the spine to cut through the human body. It's possible they got lucky, or it was just curiosity and figured it out as they went. But I doubt it. I think anybody who's going to engage in the severing of a human body likely knows what they're doing or has some experience with anatomy in general.
And with that, what were the similarities when you were looking through this and kind of coming off of what the LAPD were trying to do back in the 40s and early 50s, kind of connect to what was happening in Kansas City?
I'm sorry, what do you mean by that?
Like in terms of like the way that she was killed, Elizabeth, versus what the victim in Kansas City, were there similarities of the same types of things that happened, or was
Yeah.
it just so like what were those things that like kind of popped out where you're like, oh, I see why they did this, I see why that they think it's this person?
Yeah, so I mean, the headlines were, and this is likely what caused the LAPD's kind of alarms to go off, is that there was a 1 pound, 4.5 inch diameter piece of flesh that was cut out of Elizabeth Short's thigh after she died. There was no blood in the cavity there, so they know that he exsanguinated and drained her body of blood, and then cut certain pieces of flesh from her body, but there was no blood in it at that point. So it's almost as if the killer wants to have the ultimate pleasure or fantasy of cutting flesh from his victim without having to deal with blood flow.
Mm-hmm.
His goal seems to be simply flesh. He doesn't want blood around. And so after he exsanguinates the body, he drains it of blood. He then cuts a around 4.5 inch diameter, horseshoe shaped piece of flesh from her thigh. It was an inch thick. It was comprised of skin, subcutaneous tissue and fat, or the hypodermis, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
and then muscle. And again, this is a horseshoe or bell-shaped curve, so it kind of goes around and then has a flat base. And in addition, the police determined that it had been cut out with a razor blade, and in one smooth motion. It was almost like an arc. There was no stopping or starting. It's almost like drawing a pencil in a horseshoe shape and then getting
Wow.
that baseline at the bottom and then tearing out that piece of flesh. And that piece of flesh was also ultimately left within the body of Elizabeth Short. Similarly, with Leila Welsh, the murder victim in Kansas City in 1941, approximately 4.5 inch diameter, horseshoe shaped piece of flesh of a thickness of 1 inch, comprised of skin, subcutaneous tissue and fat or hypodermis, and muscle, was cut out of her thigh with a razor blade in one smooth motion. There were no stopping and starting marks. It was just a smooth, arc along with the base there. It's literally the same size and shape piece of flesh cut from the thighs of both women, and that piece of flesh was also discarded behind by the killer. So that's just one of the similarities between the two murders. There's certain shape similarities between the two murders. Elizabeth Short had her mouth cut from the edges in a V that the police described towards her ears. Leila Welsh had her throat cut from the center base of her throat, up towards her ears. And again, the police described it as being a V shape. And there's numerous other similarities between the two victims and murders that are detailed in the book.
That is an incredible story, and also infuriating, right? When you look at it back now, you're like, how did you, Kansas City? Come on, But then when you get into the politics of it, it makes complete sense, right? Whether or not
it makes sense, but it's also like, don't you guys want to find this killer, and don't you want some justice for these victims? Like, can't you put politics aside? I don't know. But then again, I'm not a deputy police chief in Kansas City in 1949, so maybe, who knows how they justified it, but it's still shocking all these decades later to think what could have been done.
Right. And both of these women weren't, ordinary in the sense that you walk by them and you won't, you wouldn't know who they were because they're just going about their lives. I mean, Leila was in Kansas City. She was from a well-to-do family, right? And then you have an aspiring actress here in Hollywood. People, they're up and coming, or they're in the mix. They're in the mingle with everybody at that time. So they're they're more known than the average Joe or Jane in the world, right? So it's like kind
Yeah,
of
in a way. I mean, so what's interesting is that both women, though, were pretty humble in a way, and I don't know if I'd describe them as shy, but they weren't necessarily like ostentatious or huge personalities. They were both described as being really graceful and beautiful and kind of kind and friendly. You know, they didn't stand out as like some huge personalities or something. And by the way, Elizabeth Short, one of the big distortions about her that I disprove in the book is what you just said. No offense, you have every right to say it,
no, it's fine.
but that she was an aspiring actress and she was out in Hollywood trying to get famous and only found death ironically or found fame ironically in death. And none of that is actually true. She wasn't in LA to get any acting roles, had no aspirations to become famous, never auditioned, never met with directors or producers trying to secure roles, never stood in line at the studios hoping for extra work, never tried to cozy up to folks who acted. In fact, one of the women she lived with and was really close with was an actor herself, and Beth never asked her for help in getting acting roles. So she was in Los Angeles. She came out for love. She came out because a guy she had been dating asked her to come out and hang with him, and she did. And then pretty soon she realized that this is a crazy, amazing city, and there's so many servicemen back from the war, and they're all asking me out on dates, and I want to be young. I'm 22 years old, and here I am in Hollywood, and I want to have a good time. And so they kind of break up, and then she tries to get back together with him, and there's a whole Chicago connection with that as well. You know, she lived in Chicago for about 3 to 4 weeks before she arrived in LA and loved Chicago, and there's all kinds of crossovers with Chicago there as well.
Well, thank you for disproving it. I mean, it's what you read, on the internet. So again, it's not always
everywhere,
true, obviously, but yeah,
everywhere.
That's kind of been the lore of it, and perhaps maybe it's been Hollywoodized by people over the years, like looking through it, making it this more of a, if you can romanticize something like that by looking back about what we were just talking about, coming to Hollywood and never making it only after you were famous or after you're gone, I should say. So fascinating story, though, all over the place. I mean, I imagine looking through all of this and seeing the similarities between the two murders. Was there anything afterwards that you saw from his life, from the alleged crimes in Kansas City and then in California? You mentioned that there were files like years after these murders happened. So they were onto him, they just couldn't necessarily 100% prove it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as late as 1950, the LAPD was flying out to St. Louis to go interview him and to question him. And that continued. And in fact, in the district attorney files into 51 and 1952, his name tops the suspect list. When you look at the list and it's not alphabetized, his name is always at number 1. Wow. They continue to investigate him until the very end. And if the department had remained on that investigation, they would have discovered a life of criminal activity up until the moment he died in 1977 in Kansas City. And I was able to uncover quite a bit of evidence of that activity. He was a bona fide stalker. He stalked many women. He was violent with women. He ended up stalking the entire management company of the apartment building in which he lived because he stopped paying rent and they decided to get rid of him. And he, instead of fighting it in court, he stalked 20, 30 people who worked for the management company, including their lawyers, outside their homes. And he was doing this in his 40s. This isn't a guy in his 20s. Then eventually he gets into major financial trouble. He was embezzling from an insurance company and he escapes to the Bahamas in the late 60s and then gets thrown out of the Bahamas for something major went down there. His family was never able to find out, but he got into a lot of trouble, returns to Kansas City, and then takes his old white Rambler station wagon out of storage, and for the next 5-6 years lives out of his car driving around the upper Midwest, Nebraska, Ohio, Indiana, crisscrossing freeways, highways, living out of his car. It's a very odd story and a lot of other sort of unsettling details, not just in his later years, but also in his early years, including the mysterious drowning of his sister when she was 7 years old and he was 12 years old, and the circumstances surrounding that drowning that I believe are highly suspicious.
I mean, yeah. I mean, and people who do this, right? They don't typically stop,
Hmm.
right? Like necessarily. So I imagine if you had more time, right? That's always the thing,
Yeah,
more time to dive into all of that other time outside of these two cases and look at missing persons and whatnot. I would be curious, or even if you did come across things where you're like, well, that's interesting. He was up in this area of the country and there's these missing people, and 20% of them are females at this age that have the same looks or feels as far as their persona as these two victims here. It'd be interesting just knowing how, like the
yeah,
human brain works. I imagine, because serial killers, have been, a lot of them, they're still, like we were talking about H.H. Holmes earlier, there's
yeah,
a belief that he was doing lots of things before he admitted to them and then were actually arrested for, right?
yeah.
So it's interesting, the case goes on, but you certainly found a compelling argument and you believe that this is the person, right?
Yeah, I really do. And I have gone through, laborious research efforts looking at every single person who has been scrutinized before, those who haven't been scrutinized. I was amazed by what I discovered in the investigation of Carl Balsiger. And I think when you look at the totality of the evidence, I think it's a pretty overwhelming case.
Thank you for sharing this and indulging me and asking all of my questions, because I certainly am no expert on this particular case, right by some of the information I just told you about, her aspirations in Hollywood. But either way, I feel like a lot of people might have the same assumptions I did. So to clear them up, and
Yeah.
I really do appreciate the work that, I can't imagine the work it did just to comb through these things and pick up where the LAPD kind of left off. Did
Yeah.
you make any connections back to anybody from that time? I know it's some years ago, but does anybody, or throughout the LAPD now, are they like, oh yeah, like we're happy somebody's doing it?
Yeah, so most of the contacts I have that are within LAPD worked there in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, but they knew a lot of the folks who worked on the original investigation. And they also were able to take a look at the evidence that I had and talk through with me their thoughts, their process from a kind of, I would say, a more advanced era
Hmm.
of police work 20, 30 years after the Black Dahlia. And they also had a lot of information about things they had heard about the Black Dahlia murder. And in fact, one of the detectives I spoke with actually had the case. It was his case in the 80s when it was a cold case. And
Hmm.
so they were really instrumental in helping me understand and shape the evidence and what it all means, which was really thrilling. And then I did get to, extensively communicate with Betty Bersinger, the woman who found the body in 1947, about 6 months before she passed on at 102 years old.
Wow.
And she gave me the crucial evidence that is in the introduction of the book about the way the body was actually left by the killer, which really upends the case.
Unbelievable. And people will have to read the book, Sisters in Death. Eli Frankel, thank you so much for talking with me. I appreciate it. Where can people buy the book?
Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, it's online, bookstores. There's an audiobook, Kindle book, hardcover. It's pretty easy to find at any online bookseller or in bookstores.
And are you still on your book tour? It looks
I
like you're in a
am.
hotel room right now.
Yeah.
Yeah. Where are
Yeah,
you
I'm
at
in a
now? Where are you
hotel.
coming up?
What's that?
Where are you at now, and where are you going?
I'm in Cincinnati right now, and
All
I'm
right.
doing a book event tomorrow here, which is exciting. And I got a couple of cities coming up, but I've been to like 7 or 8 cities right now. So it's been great meeting everybody. And, every city, every bookstore, the audience, the cultures are all kind of different. It's really interesting seeing how different parts of the country react and talk about the case.
Well, thank you for what you do. I appreciate it. And thanks for taking
Yeah.
the time.